Now to a story that is as disturbing as it is unsurprising and frankly getting a lot less of attention than it deserves. Billions of dollars that was earmarked for military families and facilities is instead going towards President Trump's border wall. The Pentagon notifying lawmakers it's diverting funds away from more than 100 military construction projects, total value $3.6 billion, and all to pay for the president's border wall.
We think by the end of next year, which will be sometime right after the election, actually, but we think we're going to have close to 500 miles of wall, which will be complete.
Cutting funds Congress approved for all sorts of programs, like $40 million from Camp Lejeune, $160 million from West Point, and the single largest cut in the United States and its territories, $400 million for efforts to rebuild military sites in Puerto Rico after they were wrecked by Hurricane Maria. In all, 23 states and 3 U.S. territories are affected, with Democratic districts missing out on about $101 million more than Republican districts. President Trump says the money is needed as a matter of national security.
It is when you have thousands of people trying to rush our country. I think that's national security. When you have drugs pouring into our country.
But Democrats are firing back, reminding Americans of Trump's promise to have Mexico pay for his signature campaign promise. Senate Democratic leader Chuck Schumer tweeting, "It is a slap in the face to the members of the armed forces who serve our country that real Donald Trump is willing to cannibalize already allocated military funding to boost his own ego." The money from the Pentagon is projected to build 175 miles of the wall, far short of the 500 miles the president has promised, raising questions about where the additional funds will come from. And for more on this, I spoke earlier today with Washington Post national security reporter Paul Sonne. Paul, there are so many levels to this story, it's hard to know where to begin. We've got the questionable emergency and declaration to begin with, the lack of headlines about immigration or alarms or even caravan reports in months, the cuts from the U.S. military from a president who claims to support our troops like no one else. I guess I'll start with the cuts themselves, and everybody's talking about U.S. bases and things like military schools and housing, which would be bad enough, but you've reported $770 million to be cut from projects in Europe aimed at helping them deter a possible attack from Russia, at the same time that Russia has attacked and taken Crimea, attacked Ukraine, threatened the Balkans, and we're cutting money from our allies. Do we know what those cuts are and how they'll impact our allies in Europe?
Yeah, so this was a broad program that the Pentagon and actually the Obama administration put in place in 2014 after Russia's annexation of Crimea. And the idea was to make it easier for U.S. forces to come to the aid of European allies on that eastern flank with Russia, and also sort of one level in Poland, Hungary, Slovakia. So these are projects, they're often airfields, staging grounds, essentially kind of infrastructure projects that would make it easier for U.S. troops to come to the aid of NATO allies in the event of an attack from Russia.
Can't make our allies feel much safer, and it's a similar situation in Guam. North Korea specifically threatened to attack Guam. Trump vowed to protect it. Now, $250 million in cuts from our military spending in Guam. Any talk that you're hearing from the White House or the Pentagon about what they're going to do to protect Guam?
Yeah, so I mean, the official line from both the White House and the Pentagon is that they are not abandoning these projects, that they want to continue to fund them. They're going to work with Congress in order to, quote, backfill the $3.6 billion of projects that they are taking away in order to pay for barriers on the southern border. The question is whether or not Congress will agree to that. A lot of Republicans in Congress and the Republican-led Senate have said that they are willing to backfill those projects, which essentially means appropriate money again for the projects that they already appropriated money for, but Democrats have balked and said, you know, we're not going to do that.
Well, let me explore that Democratic argument. Let's say they vote to backfill these projects. Couldn't the Trump administration declare another emergency and just take the money again down the road?
Yeah, I think that's a lot of the concern that Democrats have raised, especially Senator Tim Kaine, who's on the Senate Armed Services Committee. He has said that this essentially would create a precedent for future presidents in order to just get money that Congress refuses to give them by declaring some sort of national emergency and deploying troops and then saying that whatever is needed is in support of those troops. So yes, that is one of the concerns that Democrats have raised.
Back to some of the specifics of these cuts. There's another big one coming from the military rebuilding efforts in Puerto Rico. We know this president is always critical of Puerto Rico, which makes it real easy to be awfully skeptical of this cut. What's your sense? Are you also skeptical of the reasoning?
Well, I think one of the reasons that there are a lot of projects on the block for Puerto Rico traditionally didn't get all that much money in military construction funding. These military construction projects are very highly sought after. Lawmakers in Congress, senators, congressmen are always jockeying for their districts to have these projects. And Puerto Rico, doesn't have any voting members in Congress, so it's not always top of the list. But one of the reasons that Puerto Rico has so many projects on the list is that the time period that the Pentagon's looking at here is sort of right after Hurricane Maria. So a lot of those projects are facilities that were destroyed in Puerto Rico during Hurricane Maria. They're rebuilding them with a new plan sort of a couple of years later.
And when you start looking at the totality of the domestic cuts, most of them are the kind that impact the quality of life for those in our military, things like housing and schools and daycare centers. Any idea how big a deal this is on base? Do these things get built or rebuilt often? And what's the likely impact on morale for our men and women in uniform?
So the Pentagon decided up front when they were selecting these 127 projects that they wouldn't touch military housing. So barracks and actual housing itself, and the Pentagon has been facing a lot of criticism about the quality of military housing, and so that's why they made that decision. So none of the projects on the list are actually housing, but you do see a lot of schools. There's 9 schools at various U.S. military installations around the world, home and abroad. You also see there's, for example, a child daycare center, a child development facility at Joint Base Andrews, which is outside of D.C. And these things don't get built and rebuilt very often. A lot of what you're seeing here are projects that are replacing a school on a base that was built decades ago or hasn't been updated in decades. For example, in Puerto Rico, the projects are replacing stuff that not only was ruined in the hurricane, but previous to that was built in the 1940s. And so a lot of these projects are sort of very sought after by a lot of these bases in order to get updates that aren't always forthcoming. There's sometimes old infrastructure. So to see them sort of put on hold or frozen or possibly not get done at all is disappointing for people.
Paul, you've given us an idea of what the official word is from the White House here. It's that they haven't given up on these projects. They're still hoping that Congress will swoop in and help. But there's a real potential PR problem here as well, because the American public are going to see this as cuts coming from our military to pay for the Trump's border wall that he said Mexico would pay for. How big of a PR problem do you think this poses for the White House?
Well, we kind of live in a new era on that, where sometimes things that would be a problem for a previous president in terms of PR doesn't necessarily turn out to be a problem for this president. So I think a lot of Trump's constituency is very in favor of making sure that there are more barriers, more fences on the southern border, and so it's a question of them sort of weighing their interests. But as you point out, Trump did say on the campaign trail repeatedly that he would be getting funding from Mexico for this wall, and then he has turned around and this year alone he's taking over $6 billion from the Pentagon budget without approval from Congress in order to build these barriers on the southern border. So certainly that has rankled people. Whether or not that will turn the tide for anyone who already is a supporter of the president is pretty unclear at this point, I think.
Finally, Paul, I've seen lots of reporting, including from the Post, that sort of dissect the cuts in different ways. More cuts from blue districts than from red, more from blue states than from red, more from non-border states than from border states. They're interesting, but I'm wondering if you find any of those dissections to be particularly meaningful.
Yeah, so I don't think we see any sort of trend that is like, for example, this is all from Democratic states. You see things, for example, there is a middle school at Fort Campbell in Kentucky that is on the block. That's Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell's district. So, there you see things, for example, in Alaska, there are a lot of cuts, which has 2 Republican senators. So you see, it's not as if all of this is from Democratic districts. And the Pentagon has said that they tried not to take into account, or they didn't take into account any of the political leanings of the districts when they made these decisions. So I don't think when you break it down, you necessarily see sort of one way or the other. The one place where I think it's very obvious that they purposely did, they wanted to do international projects over domestic projects because it doesn't have as much of a political backlash. The Pentagon is already saying that it wants some of these allied nations to pay for these projects themselves instead of having it come out of the Pentagon budget. So you did sort of see the pendulum swing a little bit that way in terms of them being more international projects. But within the United States, I don't know if there is any, you can sort of crunch the numbers and there are some trends, but it doesn't seem like anything really sticks out in boldface there as something that was sort of obviously purposeful.
Paul Sonne covers the military and national security for the Washington Post. Paul, it's a story that has been underreported this week. Thanks for helping us reverse that trend.
Thanks for having me.
And up next, there's a new push to change the way we elect presidents in this country, and it's gaining momentum. We'll show you why a growing number of people want to scrap the Electoral College next.